Welcome. I'm going to give everyone a minute or so to file in before we begin here. All right. Thank you so much for joining us for this webinar. I am so pleased to have Dr. Keith Williams here. Just a few housekeeping things before we begin. So Dr. Williams will run through his presentation, and if you have any questions, you can type them in to using the chat feature. So if you see at the bottom of your screen where it says chat, you can type in a question, and then at the end, we'll have some time for Q&A. This webinar is being recorded, and we will have the recording up on our website, wholegrainscouncil.org, sometime next week, and I'll send you guys an email when that goes up online. And additionally, we will be posting these slides to our website as well. Those will also be on wholegrainscouncil.org. If not today, then definitely early next week. And again, we'll share those links via email. And for our registered dietitians who are on the line, this webinar is available for CPEU credit. So we will send out an email maybe today, maybe early next week, if not today, by Monday, with a link to get that certificate. So yeah, you'll get your slides, you'll get the recording, and you'll get the certificate. And again, please do feel free to type in questions to chat as you have them. So with that, I think I would like to turn it over to you, Dr. Williams, if you're ready to go.
I am. Thank you, and I appreciate the opportunity to speak to your audience today. As a clinician, I frequently see children and adolescents who exhibit extremely limited diets, even to the point of having nutrient deficiencies. Just in this year, I've seen 7 children with scurvy. I've seen a child with pellagra, and I've seen countless kids with iron deficiencies. So kids that eat such a limited diet that they develop deficiencies is pretty typical for us. A lot of the interventions that we develop to address these things are based on the underlying mechanisms and principles involved in taste. And that's what I want to talk to you about, some of that research today and different interventions that we use. And hopefully some of these things might be applicable to you in your own work. And we'll chat about that today. Today, I've kind of divided it into 3 parts. We're going to talk about what governs our food choices. How do we learn food preferences? What does the research involving the introduction of whole grain show? And finally, what could you do to help patients, clients, or consumers to learn to eat new foods? There are numerous factors that govern what we select to eat. Different factors dominate our choices at different times and under a range of different conditions. So they're not the same all the time. Things change. As a provider who works with families to change their children's dietary behaviors, it's important for me to consider these factors and realize that they're not going to be the same all the time. These factors have different importance across the span of time. And those are things that I have to kind of consider in treatment planning. The palatability of food, especially taste pleasantness, is perhaps the most important factor in determining food selection. Sometimes people will say, well, kids eat what they like. And to a degree, I think that's true. For those of you that are clinicians, you know that dietary non-adherence can reach rates of 80 to 90%. So it doesn't matter what you tell people to eat, they often do not eat those things. And I think in large part, this is attributed to the fact that they either don't like the foods that you recommend or don't think they're going to like the foods that you recommend. And that's probably the latter is more often the case. If you can get people to learn to eat these healthy foods, very often the rate of adherence is probably going to increase. Taste preferences are genetically determined. Your ability to taste, how well you can taste things is genetically influenced. Probably you've all heard of the term super taster, and actually I am one. So your taste sensitivity can vary. However, taste preferences are not set in stone, and they change across the course of your lifetime. So what you like now doesn't mean that's what you're going to always like, and that you can't add things to your diet. And I think that's one of the things that many people don't really understand that well. Convenience has become a significant factor for a number of families. You probably work with both maybe adults or parents who are involved in this wide range of activities. Maybe both parents work. And as a result of that, a lot of the food that they obtain for their family or themselves is based on convenience. They do it to save time and to save effort. And many of these foods are processed foods, and they obtain them from different fast food outlets. Helping families or parents or customers or consumers strike a balance between eating healthy foods and convenience can sometimes be a challenge for nutritionists or other people that try to help with diet. Whole grains can be more expensive than refined grains in at least certain times or in many cases. And people that live in food deserts or places where they don't have good access to whole grains or maybe fresh fruits and vegetables, this can certainly be a challenge as well. If you're a family that has limited resources, it may be quite rational for you to spend your money on macaroni and cheese and ramen noodles, because you know your children may eat those foods. So you're going to try to, if your finances are limited, you will most likely purchase foods that are filling, low cost, and consumed by the most number of family members. So you may not necessarily be looking at the health aspects of the food as much as you are other aspects of the food. Personal identity can affect your food selection in a number of different ways. Depending on your religion, that may affect your food choice or your food selections. If depending on your ethnic identity, that may limit the number of foods that you're exposed to as a child or even as a young adult. I was appalled at being offered salted fish for breakfast when I was in Estonia. That was not what I was used to, and I did not think that should be served at the breakfast table. Most parents in the US would never think of giving their kids chili peppers, but in Mexico, that's quite commonplace. So what your ethnic background and what you're used to in your environment is what you get used to in terms of food selection. There's a number of people that I know are becoming more aware of the environment and climate change, and as a result may be changing their diets based on that. So you see consumers that are drinking less milk because they either are not or in favor of animal rights, or they know that cow's milk production increases water consumption or water usage, so they try to drink plant-based alternatives. So they make choices based on their own personal beliefs. So these types of things can all impact food choice. People develop strong relationships with food. I suspect in times of stress or emotional turmoil, the default food selections are these foods that make people feel happier or more satisfied or somehow better. I know even speaking for myself, in the last several months, since all this lockdown has happened in our area, that I've been eating more candy, more pastry, more snack foods than I have in the last year. And I think that's largely because, and I know these food choices aren't optimal, but in the moment, I expect they somehow reduced my stress or made me happier. So I made them even though they were not great choices. In my clinical work with children, I necessarily work with families. So I work with parents all the time. Many of the kids that I work with are young children with special needs. And very often it's the mother who brings the child in for the appointment. And as we talk about food selections and different foods that the child eats and doesn't eat, it quickly becomes obvious that a lot of times food choices are made in the home to manage different relationships. The parent, and for example, sometimes I see kids that are in multi-generational households. And in those cases, the mother may feed the child foods so the child doesn't have a tantrum that would upset the grandfather. Or they don't want to have a lot of issues at the dinner table, so they present food to the children that they're going to eat and not have they're not going to be resistant to the foods that are being offered. So a lot of these things are done to manage relationships. While we all wish that many children or many adults would select more foods based on the health benefits of the foods, that's not always the case. I mean, I am an optimist, and I think some of these things are getting better, and I see people trying to make correct food choices. Unfortunately, those are not always the people that are on my caseload, but I do think people are being more aware of their diet, and certainly I think that they have the ability to make some better choices and can change. One of the things that I've been doing recently is talking to families about making change at the point of purchase so that they're selecting foods that they want their family to eat in the store. Because I know if the food makes it into the home, it's going to be harder to get people to not to eat that food or not to eat as much of that food, or to ration out that food into what may be appropriate quantities rather than large amounts of snack food or different calorie dense foods. Because if the food gets into the home, people are inevitably going to eat that food. These factors that I just talked about, they change all the time. And if we can explain the multiple benefits of healthy food, sometimes our clients or our patients are going to use the information we provide and make those choices. But that's not the only factor in food choice. There's all these different things that we just talked about. And one of the things that I'm going to talk about a lot more today is flavor and taste, and maybe ways we can help with that and help change taste preferences. Food preferences are learned. They are not necessarily, you are born with preferences to sweet and salt, but you're not born with preferences to specific foods. And that is not something that those people understand. Most people do believe that you have like these genetic predispositions towards different foods. Those preferences that people have for different foods were learned across the course of their life. I'm told that by parents that they never liked certain foods. I like to tell parents that they just didn't learn to like different foods. And I do believe that a lot of people fail to develop food preferences because of lack of exposure and misconceptions about the food. Learned aversions to specific foods are pretty powerful and thankfully pretty rare. I have a lifelong aversion to eggnog. Not because I think there's anything wrong with eggnog, but because I developed an aversion when I had the onset of a viral illness. So now I associate eggnog with that viral illness. So even smelling it makes me nauseous, even though I absolutely know what it was. It had nothing to do with the eggnog, but rather the flu. But and many people have similar stories. But these specific things don't account for what you typically see in people. So it's not that people avoid vegetables because they had this conditioned aversion to it, but very often because they think that vegetables are not going to taste good, and as a result don't ever try them. And I think that could be, it's not just vegetables, but many foods that we would consider healthy, including many whole grains or fruits or lean meats or other things. So they just avoid that. Now, one of the mechanisms for learning to like a new food is called flavor nutrient learning. Flavor nutrient learning is a form of Pavlovian conditioning in which foods become associated with post-ingestive consequences. Brownies or cake not only taste good, but they make you feel good later. So there is a post-ingestive effect from that, and you have like a fullness feeling. So very often foods are associated with their caloric effects. So if you get full from a particular food that are high in, very often foods that are high in fat, you end up developing a preference for that food. And in the opposite, conditioned aversions, like my aversion to eggnog, is also a form of flavor nutrient learning. Well, I learned about that food from the post-ingestive effects. I drank the eggnog, and then not too long after that, I got sick. And then those things have forever in my mind been linked together. Now, flavor nutrient learning does happen, and it is a mechanism for people to learn to like new foods. I don't find it's very useful in a clinical sense. I don't use it a lot to help kids learn to eat new foods, but I am aware that it is a mechanism that's used to develop taste preferences. Another form of Pavlovian conditioning, flavor conditioning, involves pairing two flavors together, and one flavor is liked and the other is new. So if you pair something that you like with something that's novel, very often you'll end up liking the novel food. The classic example of this that people use is pairing coffee, which is bitter, with sugar, which is sweet and inherently preferred by most people. So you learn to like coffee, especially initially when people start drinking coffee. They don't typically start drinking black coffee. They drink it with sugar, and across the course of time, very often will just start drinking black coffee. Some people never do, but some people will end up drinking coffee without the sugar or with less sugar or without cream. Other research has presented, a number of studies have presented vegetables or different teas that were sweetened or had some kind of flavoring or seasoning initially, and then they presented them without the seasoning or without the sweetener. So they did that with tea, presenting them first that were sweetened and then unsweetened, and the people liked them after, even without the sweetener. And that was also the case with different vegetables that were flavored initially or seasoned initially, that people learned to like them without the seasoning. We have used flavor conditioning in my clinical work. So we will, in our clinic, often pair novel foods like vegetables with preferred condiments like ketchup or ranch dressing or something else to try to get children to like different foods. The workhorse, however, of what I do is mere exposure. Mere exposure or repeated exposure is kind of the main way people learn to develop food preferences. And not just a few studies, but literally hundreds of studies have demonstrated that repeated exposure to a novel food increases preference and consumption of that food. Studies have been conducted in laboratories, schools, preschools, and a range of community settings. Most clinical and public health interventions have been designed to increase diet variety, involve some form of exposure. So personally, I've worked on a lot of studies in school settings where we've offered kids vegetables and gotten kids to taste these vegetables repeatedly to develop preferences for these vegetables. So we've worked on, in fact, I was part of a team that developed the Kids' Choice program, which is a program designed to get kids to eat more fruits and vegetables in the cafeteria setting. But lots of other similar studies have been done, or similar interventions have been developed involving the mere exposure effect. Now, while adults do some things better than infants, like play basketball maybe, or ride a bike, developing preferences for new foods is not one of the things that adults do better. Infants are superstars at developing food preferences. Infants will develop food preferences in 1 to 5 exposures. This is one of the weird things about development that's backwards. Adults usually require 20 or more exposures to develop a preference to a novel food. And I think this is largely because across the span of human development, our preferences for foods become more set and more stable, and they are harder to change. So the people that do better at learning new preferences are young people. Infants, preschoolers, toddlers are all develop food preferences at in far fewer exposures than adults or adolescents. It's pretty typical for me to hear parents say that, well, I think I'll just wait until my kids are old enough that I can reason with them before I start working on introducing new foods. Oh my gosh, don't do that. That is the worst thing you can do, because as you wait, food preferences get more and more established and they're harder to change. So in my line of work, I always prefer to see kids younger rather than older, because it's a little bit easier to change food preferences while they're younger. And I think that's a pretty typical misconception. One of the things that, if you look at the slide where I've got the number of exposures required until preference, it none of them, it takes time for anybody. It takes longer for adults, but it takes time for anybody. So it is take a more, you have to do this repeatedly over time for anybody. Let's say for school-age children, kids have to taste a food 10 to 15 times to learn to like it. That was a study done by Leanne Birch and her colleagues back in 1982. It was kind of the first of these studies, and that's been replicated tons of times since then. But what we also know is when a child is presented a food and they don't like that food, how many times does the parent present that food? On average, 1.5 times. So one of the problems is that the parent never presents the food enough times to get to the threshold where the child ends up developing a preference for that food. And I think that's the case for adults as well. They'll taste a food once, not like that food, and never eat it again. But I think in many cases, the problem is they confuse dislike and unfamiliarity. So they taste a food that they're not familiar with. It's a little weird. It's not what they're used to. And they assume they don't like that food. I think it's not true. I think the case is that food is not familiar to them, so they don't do it again. And what they need to know is if they would continue to repeatedly taste that food over time, that food would become familiar to them, and in many cases would become preferred. But that only comes through repeated exposure over time. Now, this is a graph taken from a study that we published years ago now. And this study was called Practice Does Make Perfect. This slide shows the graphs for 6 different children. These are all children with autism who were treated for extreme food selectivity. The horizontal axis shows the foods offered during treatment. So for some of the kids, it goes out into up to 70 different foods that were offered. And the vertical axis represents the number of taste exposures required until the child would eat the foods without treatment in meals. And you can see on the vertical axis, it goes from 0 to 35 different tastes for a particular food. That's like kind of the range. And we did have some foods. If you look at the very top panel, which represents case 1, you can see that the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, the 6th different food that was introduced to his diet, that child needed to taste that food like 35 times before they developed a preference for that food, before they would just, and what we counted as a preference is they would eat that food without intervention. So it did take, for some of these foods, it did take more than 5 to 10 times, but generally the 5 to 10 exposure rule was correct. But as you look further out to the right, you'll see that in case 1, case 2, case 3, case 4, in all those cases, they just started eating novel foods when they were presented. So they didn't need the 5 to 10 exposures. The 5 to 10 exposures was all developed through what we call cross-sectional research. So when they're given groups of kids just a couple different foods and counting the number of exposures required. Nobody had looked at longitudinal research before. So if you keep presenting new foods to people, does this get easier? And that's what we wanted to find out with this research. And it did. In fact, that was the case. That's why we call it practice makes perfect. So if you can get people to taste new foods and do so repeatedly, other new foods will get easier over time. So the more and more foods that they are exposed to, learning to like new foods gets easier. But you got to keep tasting the foods that you're offered. Now, what has already been done to increase selection of whole grains? If you look at the literature on introducing foods to develop food preferences, most of the work is done with vegetables. There's been some study that have done fruits and vegetables, but there have been a few that have focused on whole grains. One of these studies involved, it was a multi-component school-based intervention. And this study was effective at increasing whole grain consumption, but boy, was the mechanism complicated. They taught students to mill flour, and they learned to read labels, and they taught them to plan menus. They took them to a milling museum and showed them all the stuff involved in milling. All those are cool activities, and they did have the kids taste foods. And I think that was probably the key component in getting them to like the foods or to increase their consumption. But they did all these different things to get the kids to eat more whole grains, which that did work. The problem would be, I don't know what school's going to be able to replicate that unless they get a huge grant. And some of these things are, I think, less, like you're not going to be able to generalize that to other settings. So that was one that was impressive. They did get kids to learn to like whole grains, but they had to do a lot to get that to happen. In another study, they did get a positive effect. They did get people to increase their preference for whole grains. The participants were overweight adults enrolled in a randomized controlled study. So they were in this randomized controlled trial. The authors questioned their clinical significance because their effect size wasn't very big. I think the authors, quite frankly, expected too much because the number of times that people tasted the foods was limited to 6. That's not what we know. It typically takes longer than that to develop food preferences. So I think the adults were pretty optimistic if they thought that they could change food preferences in just 6 exposures. The number is a little low for adults. One of the things that I thought that was important is they randomized the subjects into 3 different groups. In the high group, they had 1.8 cups for women, 2.7 cups for men per day of what they wanted to eat in terms of whole grains. And they did that for 6 weeks, a couple different ones, so there wasn't too much. Now in the medium group, it was a half a cup per day for 6 weeks. And the low group was just a tablespoon per day for 6 weeks. What they didn't find a significant effect for dose. That is the most, and like this may be the take-home point for this whole talk today. It's not the amount you get them to eat at one time. It's the frequency of tasting over time. Very often where we're introducing novel foods in our clinical setting, the size of the taste is the size of a grain of rice or the size of a pea. And if you can get kids just to taste that much repeatedly over time, and remember, these are kids who are so limited in their diets, they have scurvy. If you can just get them to taste little things over time, they develop preferences for different foods. And I think that's going to hold. I was actually pretty happy to see this, that it showed that there wasn't a significant effect for dose. It's not the dose, it's the frequency. So it did kind of, it provided a more evidence for something that I already believed. And another study was, I called it the market basket study. So essentially they gave people a big basket of whole grains. They assigned them to two different conditions. One was a whole grain condition where adults received a great big basket of grains for all their meals. And in another condition, they received refined grains. Not surprisingly, the people that received the big basket of whole grains ate the whole grains and developed preferences for the whole grain. So they did learn to eat the whole grains when that's what they were exposed to. So, and they, one of the quotes from the article was, encouraging consumers to focus on the enjoyment of taste may be more effective than emphasizing the health benefits of whole grain consumption. I believe that's true. I do believe if you can get people to like the foods that you want them to eat, they will eat that food. If the only thing you do is tell them how healthy it is and how if you keep eating whole grains, it'll reduce your effective, the chances of a heart attack, that's, even though what you're telling them is true, I don't know if it's going to be effective. Because the problem is you're not going to suffer the heart attack today, probably, so that it doesn't make when you don't come into contact with a consequence over prolonged periods of time, the messages are not going to stick. So I think if you can get people to like things so that the reason they eat the foods is because they want to eat the food, then you're going to be a lot better chance of they consuming whatever the target foods you're working on. One of the things that I think would work if you happen to be a food company would be using fading. Fading is where you systematically, like the technical term for fading, or the technical definition is stimulus fading is the behavioral term that is defined as systematically altering the physical properties of a stimulus. So you're making a change in maybe the wheat flour, like how much whole grain is in this flour compared to how much refined grain. So you're maybe changing the ratio of that. Just as an example, I have to often teach kids to take vitamins. And one of the things that we're doing is we crush a Flintstones multivitamin, and then I have parents put 1/6 of that crushed multivitamin into 1 cup of juice. And then they systematically add more and more of the multivitamin until they're taking the multivitamin. So we're using fading to get them to increase vitamin consumption. You can do the same thing in other areas. This one study, they gradually changed the amount of whole grain flour used by the school cafeteria from 0 to 67% in 7 increments. And there wasn't any difference between the preference ratings based on the varying levels of whole wheat. So as they faded up the amount of whole wheat, the preferences as rated by the students did not change. They got used to eating more whole wheat. Now, they did it over 7 increments. Could they have done it over 2 or 4 or 5? I don't know. That's an empirical question. But it does show that you could use something like that to increase consumption of whole grains. Now, the bad part is, if you're a mom at home trying to get your kids to eat more whole grains, it would be harder for you to do this unless you really want to bake all your own bread or make all your own foods from scratch. It could be done. I suspect it could be readily done, but is that feasible? And maybe at the individual level, no, but at the industry level, probably. In another study, they, again, relying upon repeated exposure, they they gave different amounts of whole grains to these two different groups. Again, there wasn't differences between the experimental groups, so there wasn't a difference between dose, but they were able to get these adults to learn to eat more whole grains through repeated exposure. So this kind of repeated exposure has been used with adults. It's also been used with children. And 110 Danish kids, they got them to eat these things they called Nordic bars that consisted of pumpernickel, dried sea buckthorn berries, and rye flakes. The intake and liking increased after exposure. And the goal was to get them to eat these healthy whole grain snacks. So we've talked about, what is the research shown so far. And now I want to talk to you about what kind of things do I think you could do. Well, I think the core of your intervention, no matter what it is, needs to be some form of repeated taste exposure. I think one classic mistake made by parents and clinicians is to focus on the serving as the initial goal and not the taste. So when parents offer some new food, rather than trying to get their kid just to taste it and then stop, they're trying to get their kid to eat an entire serving or just take 4 more bites of this food. That probably is counterproductive. It's going to be harder for a person to eat a whole serving of a novel food than just taste that food. And I think that in many cases, like, it's not uncommon for us to see kids who look at a new food, they might gag, or when they taste it, they gag. And I think it's not because they have oral motor issues, it's because they've already made up in their mind they don't like that food. But if they know that the only thing they have to do is just take one little taste, that's it, then you're done, then they can do that. And if we can, and I tell parents, the initial goal is not nutrition, it's cooperation. I just want them to taste the food, and that's it. Because if I can get them to do that over time, then I know the repeated exposure is going to work, and the kid will often develop a preference for that food. So if I can just get them to start tasting things over time, or at least tolerating things, that's all I need. And I think that people don't understand how hard this is. And I'll give you an example. Last year, I had a father call me, and he said he was going to be in town for business in the local area. And he had a kid who was a really selective eater. And while he was at his business appointment, he was going to drop the kid off. We could fix their selective eating issues, and then he'd pick them up at the end of the day and they'd go home. We are not going to fix, these lifelong histories of selective eating in an afternoon. Unfortunately, our clinical work, it's not like Jiffy Lube.
Can I pause you, Dr. Williams?
Yep.
Is your PowerPoint still up?
It is.
Okay, one moment. Let me edit one setting just to make sure that everyone can still see it. There we go.
Got it?
Yes, thank you so much.
Don't worry if you missed any of these things. We've got the slides for you, so you'll have everything. But you're going to have negative reactions to initial tastes of a new food. That's not only common, that's expected. And if you let people know that at first they're not going to necessarily like a food based on that first taste, or 2 tastes, or 5 tastes, or maybe 10 tastes, that they just have to keep tasting over time, then I think a lot more people are going to be willing to taste repeatedly, at least enough times that they'll develop preferences. Modeling involves having people imitate what others do. This extends to eating behaviors. A number of studies have used modeling to introduce new foods. We do this in our clinical work, and we've used it in school-based studies as well. We've used it in preschools to teach kids to eat mangoes. We've used it in elementary schools to get kids to eat fruits and vegetables. So we do use modeling all the time. And we have even used it with adults and adolescents. I've worked with adolescents and a few adults who have ARFID, and we've used modeling as a component in our interventions designed to get people to eat novel foods. Sometimes persons with ARFID will taste a new food if a significant other will taste that food. I've had a couple of young men who were college students who would imitate what their girlfriends did. So if their girlfriends would taste this novel vegetable, they would taste it too. And we spend time training the girlfriend on what to say and more importantly, what not to say. So we have used modeling even with adults that's been successful. Over the years, countless parents have described their children tasting or eating new foods to us, and they commonly report their kids taste new foods more often when they're hungry. Okay, well that makes complete sense to me. There's a higher probability that people are going to taste new foods when they're hungry. So if you set up occasions for tasting when the person is hungry, you probably increase the probability they're going to taste that food. So we typically tell people, when should you introduce novel foods? Prior to meals. We're actually right in the middle of a school-based study that got interrupted by this pandemic. And in that study, we had two conditions. We offered a novel food with lunch, and we offered a novel food prior to lunch. And we already found pretty good evidence that when we do pre-meal presentation, so offering a little taste of novel food before the children get their lunch, they taste the novel food more often than if we offered it with their lunch. And I think the reason for that is that when you're offering only the novel food, you don't have the competition from the food served at lunch. So of course, kids that have ho-hos in their lunch and a juice box, they're going to eat that food and not necessarily going to eat the little tiny pieces of bell pepper that we have cut up. But when we offer just the pepper and they haven't had their lunch yet, then they're more likely to taste the food that we're offering them. We do use positive reinforcement in our clinical work, and we've used it in our school-based studies. If you're working with adults, you may not use the same reinforcers that we do, like stickers and Super Balls, but you may use different reinforcers like contingent praise and things, typically some form of social reinforcer. But even contingent praise can be a successful mechanism for increasing tasting. Because if you can get the person to, if the reinforcement serves to increase the probability that they're going to taste the food, then at the end of the day, the repeated exposure will help them learn to like that food. When foods are more readily available, children are more likely to eat these foods. I discussed studies in which people were given weekly supplies of whole grains. Other research has offered persons more choices of foods, often vegetables or fruits, to increase the chances that these things are going to be selected. So if the foods you want people to eat are more readily available, you increase the probability that they're going to eat those foods or they're going to select them. Many of you have probably heard of nudge interventions, and these interventions are based on the science of behavioral economics. and where there, which is has a huge overlap of what I do, which is applied behavior analysis, is what I use in my clinical work. And if you can get people, and very often in nudge interventions, they may be reordering the cafeteria so they've got healthy foods first, and then further down the road, they've got the dessert. So people can try to select some healthy foods before they get exposed to foods that you may not want them to choose as often. Last year, I had the pleasure of spending some time at the National University of Ireland, and I'm doing as a Fulbright specialist. And many mornings, I would eat the hotel breakfast, and they gave me this whole grain toast, and I covered it with this delicious Irish butter. Many people would say that I'd ruined the health effects of the whole grain toast by putting butter on it. I don't know that I have that view. I think that if eating foods with condiments or dressings or other things doesn't take away from the health benefits of that food. I mean, arguably, you probably shouldn't eat that much butter, but I think that if you can get people to taste the foods that you're trying to target, whatever whole grains or fruits or vegetables or whatever you're trying to work on, across the course of time, you can change some of these other things. So you can fade out condiments, you can fade out other things so that you have more of just the healthier foods. If you can change things to make them more palatable, I think it probably is going to increase the consumption of those foods. One of the things that I know they're trying to do at Penn State University now is they've got programs where they're cooking vegetables with different seasonings, and then offering these seasoned vegetables and showing that those foods are more readily accepted than plain vegetables. So they're modifying the taste to try to increase consumption of vegetables. I think the same thing is probably easily done with other foods, including whole grains. So if you increase palatability, you're probably going to increase consumption. Okay. I've got two, instead of hammering you with a whole bunch of research articles, I did select two articles from the New Yorker that talk about increasing taste preferences and repeated exposure. And both of those are at our website, broccolibootcamp.com. So there's, if you look at presentations, there's the slides from today's presentation, as well as those two articles that I thought you might like. I also put my email address there. So if you guys have any questions about any of the things that we talked about today, please feel free to call me. I can give you links to research or tell you about different articles, or if you have a question, I'd be glad to answer that for you. And at this point, I'm going to stop with the presentation and go to any of the questions that you had. So I'll stop sharing the slides. It looks like they're in the... Okay.
Thank you so much for your presentation. This was super helpful. And just a reminder before we answer a few questions, we have about 5 minutes left. For those of you who joined late, this presentation is being recorded. So we'll have the slides up, or we'll have the video up on our website next week, as well as the slides. And for the registered dietitians who are looking for CPEU credits, we'll send you an email next week as well.
To answer Crystal's question, as I know a child who refuses unfamiliar food every time. He will choose not to eat at all rather than choosing something new, trying to pair food he does not like, and he will go through the effort of separating things, for example, mixing peas with mac and cheese. Recommendations. Yeah, there's actually, that is what we do. That's in our wheelhouse. This is who we see all the time. And I think there's a number of different things. One of the things you can do is, like, I wonder if you could use fading in some ways. So instead of mixing a whole bunch of peas in the macaroni and cheese, maybe mix one pea. Or one of the things we do is plate A, plate B. So maybe it's snacks. We would present a little tiny, like we could present a pea. And if the child tastes the pea, then they get their preferred snack. So they eat one pea and then they get whatever they would get for their regularly scheduled snack. So the snack would be contingent on pea consumption or whatever the target food is. But there has to be some mechanism to get the kid to taste the food. So you can make access to other foods contingent. You can make access to reinforcers contingent. You can use modeling. One of the things the pediatrician typically recommends to parents is, well, just give them healthy foods and they'll either eat or eventually they'll eat because they're going to be hungry. Okay, that's probably true, but how many parents are going to put up with their children being hangry? Sometimes not many. So we've come up with a bunch of different alternatives to that. So we use other interventions to try. And one of the things is we try to do some form of repeated taste exposure and getting them to gradually taste things over time. So our program of exit criterion and repeated taste exposure is something we've used clinically and published on that. So there are numbers of different things that I think would work for some of these kids that are selective eaters. Does cilantro taste like soap? That's a good question. It doesn't taste like soap to me, but I can taste things like, I have a son who likes all those nasty craft beers. I am not drinking those. They're disgusting, especially the ones that they call sours. I am never drinking those ever. I can't even hardly take a little taste because they're so horrible. So there are a bunch of things that I have trouble with. Now I've learned to, like fruits and vegetables, I don't have any trouble with those except for Brussels sprouts I'm not a fan of, but otherwise I don't have, but I think it's because I've repeatedly been exposed to them over time. And I don't know that I see a reason to learn to like craft beers. I expect they probably would work, but I do like cilantro. I don't know, but it doesn't taste like soap. All right, given the, what's the best practice for how often to give the grain of brown? Once a day, that's a good question. Like how often should you do? This is a numbers game. It matters how many times you do it. Does you have to do it multiple times per day? No. But if you only did one taste of brown rice a year, would they really learn to like brown rice? Maybe in 12 years. But I think if you did it more than that, that would be okay. But I think you just have to be I tell parents that we have to do something regularly every day. So it can be a couple of times a day. And very often, when do we do some of this? At snack times. So we'll do our tasting, maybe some kind of tasting plan at the snacks. Because if they miss out on a snack or they don't eat that much of the snack, we don't care anyway because it's a snack. So we do have to do something, because we have found that if you do it less often than daily, if it becomes like a weekly or monthly, you just don't make a lot of progress. So they have to commit to doing something, not every day or not every meal, but if they do something daily, that's often enough. In fact, the little boy that I just worked with, like I'm seeing patients today, the little boy that I saw this morning, he eats a bunch of fruits, he eats one or two meats, but he eats no vegetables other than broccoli, which that is the super vegetable, I guess, but we're going to have a vegetable of the week. And every day for every meal, he's going to get one little taste of a vegetable. We're going to start with carrots because that's what he tasted for me today. So he's going to eat a carrot just a little tiny taste of carrot, little tiny speck before every meal and snack for the week. And then there's going to be another vegetable, and we're going to rotate through the vegetables. And then after we've rotated through, he's going to do 2 specks of carrot. And then we're going to rotate again. So we're going to gradually fade up the amount of tastes of carrots. And I think we're going to get some of these things into his diet through the repeated exposure, even if it's just 1 speck before a meal or snack.
Thank you so much. And I'm afraid we're out of time for
Okay.
today. But his email address and website are on the slide. So if you have more questions, I would say definitely visit his website, Broccoli Bootcamp, and also feel free to reach out. But thank you so much. This was wonderful.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Thanks.
All right.
Bye, everyone.